People often ask me about my control scheme and what I use in my sometimes a little crazy fights against the fireboards, and what devices I have and how I set them up. And the reality is, setting up your controls the proper way is maybe the most important thing you can do to enhance your overall ability at combat in Elite Dangerous. Nothing else comes close, really. Like, all the practice you can do in Fight Assist Off, all the training in terms of getting your fine aim control to a high level, none of that compares with regards to how important it is to set up your controls in a way that is conducive to effectively being able to control your ship. Now, I am a mouse and keyboard player, as the fact of my control overlay, which will be showing up later, but I can bring up here for the sake of argument, and it's going to be bigger than usual because this is about control, so you can see it here. And again, I've labeled my keyboard buttons, and I'll talk in a minute about what each of these things is. But I'm a mouse and keyboard player. Let me start by saying that there is no superior control device in Elite Dangerous. Some of our very best pilots are play with an Xbox controller like UNAV, play with stick and keyboard like Emgram. Before I switched to mouse and keyboard, I actually played with mouse and throttle. I'm weird. Eventually my throttle broke, and so I moved over to my keyboard. And my keyboard, as you'll see in a minute, is nothing special, really. It's a $30 5-year-old keyboard that isn't really anything fancy, which, by the way, Commander Aradonio Stormrage showed me, and I was like, I want one of those. So I got this keyboard, and we'll talk about it in a minute. But again, there's nothing really special or fancy about control devices when it comes to Elite Dangerous. What matters is how you configure them and how you use them. But possibly even more importantly, the first one, how you configure them. So I'm not going to be talking a lot about joysticks, whether it's mouse and stick and throttle or stick and stick or other analog devices like joypads, because I don't use them, so I can't really tell you that much. There's discussion around whether you should curves and the like, but I am not the best person to advise on what works best as far as sticks and other analog control devices are concerned. But I have some experience with mouse and keyboard, and I can probably talk about how to properly configure those and the things that goes with those, which there's actually a few other things that are important to note. One of the things that is important to note is that the Cobra engine, the game engine that powers Elite Dangerous, is very frame rate sensitive. Everything handles better at higher frame rates. The sort of lower your frame rates go, the wonkier everything becomes. And maybe that's true in general for games, but my personal feeling is that it's particularly true in Elite Dangerous. So, I mean, there are going to be situations where you're just exploring or hauling and it doesn't matter. But if you are serious about combat, one of the first things you want to do is actually tweak your graphics settings and go on something like low or medium, depending on like whatever your graphic card can fit. And possibly the most important setting that you want to make sure is disabled is vertical sync. Vertical sync, I mean, it's the explaining how exactly vertical sync works is beyond the purpose of this video, but suffice it to say, in many circumstances, vertical sync can increase input lag and as a result make your controls wonkier, in addition to also introducing stutter if your video card can't keep up in terms of the overall frame rate. So these are probably the two most important things to set a quality ratio that sort of feeds into whatever refresh rate your display can handle, and disable vertical synchronization. Once that is done, you can hit Control F. If you hit Control F, now you can't see it on the screen because I'm showing my big faces on top of it, but if you move my face here in the bottom left of the screen, you'll see that my PC is pushing almost 500 frames per second, which is way, way more than you need. You don't need 500 frames per second to be effective at combat, but you do need a good 60 at least if your sort of screen is a 60 frames per second screen. or ideally even, oh, wow, what happened here? I hit Control F on the wrong thing, and I think I can get myself back to where I was. All right. See if you can get your frame rate to a point where the game kind of feels smooth. And obviously, your hardware is your hardware, so you're not going to be able to kind of like, make miracles. But something to consider as you kind of get underway. The next thing to consider is like how you set up your mouse, because the default setting of your mouse in Elite Dangerous is just awful. The mouse has roll on x-axis configured by default, and roll on x-axis of a mouse is terrible. I mean, with very, very few exceptions, I think most everyone agrees that having yaw on mouse results in an easier control experience. So if you haven't already, shifting your mouse to be yaw on the x-axis, highly, highly, highly recommended. Again, these are all suggestions. Controls are a very personal thing. I'm not saying there's a right or wrong way to do things. I'm just saying these are my personal recommendations based on my experience. Your mileage may vary. I'm going to try and be candid with regards to what I felt has the major difference and what was more important, but you are welcome to do whatever you want. Like, play the game the way you like. I'm not here to tell you how to play your game. I'm here to share what worked for me and what I think might help you. If it works for you, great. If it doesn't, ignore it. No harm done. So the next thing you really, really, really want, especially if you're going to be flying with flight assist off, which in combat you probably will want to do, is you will want to enable relative mouse for both axes. So you want to enable relative mouse on the x-axis, and you will want to enable relative mouse on the y-axis. These are disabled by default. So again, this is another setting that you kind of need to change from the default setting. Now, the problem with doing this is that it makes your controls in Super Cruise and with Flight Assist enabled very wonky and unfriendly. So there's a few ways to go about it. There's actually a disable relative mouse switch or toggle, which in most cases you would want to make a switch, because I don't think you want to fly with relative mouse as a toggle and drive you crazy. So this should probably be set as a toggle, and you can set a key to disable relative mouse if you want. This is a change that was recently introduced and a very welcome one, because again, being able to disable relative mouse when you're flying Super Cruise is something that is very welcome. Now, this didn't exist when I kind of quote learned to fly in Elite Dangerous. So as you can see, in my case, it's not mapped. The reason it's not mapped is because I actually use my numpad, and we'll talk about that in a moment, to fly outside of combat. So when I am docking and when I'm flying in Super Cruise, I actually use my numerical pad on the right side of my keyboard to control the ship, and I don't touch my mouse almost at all. I only pick up my mouse when I get into combat or when there's other special situations like navigating menus and things like that. The enabling of a relative mouse is not in and of itself sufficient, however. You also need to set the relative mouse rate, because if your relative mouse axis X and Y is on, but your relative rate is practically 0, then relative rate ain't going to do a thing. You want to crank this relative mouse rate all the way up or close to all the way up. Your dead zone should be 0. Your power core should be 0. These introduce nonlinearity in your mouse behavior and are an awful, terrible thing that might have made sense in an era where mice were things that had a ball that was rolling inside a mouse. Since pretty much every mouse nowadays is optical, you really don't need a dead zone and power core these days. These should be set to 0, and if it was up to me, I would disable these settings from the game settings entirely, because they are only bound to create issues and practically serve no benefit whatsoever. So these should be at 0. Where you get to more of a personal preference is when it comes to mouse sensitivity. And this mouse sensitivity one is a bit tricky because this setting goes hand in hand with the DPI or CPI. Different applications have different values of or how they call it, but essentially your sensitivity setting in Windows of how your your mouse is configured in. And the higher you set it outside of the game in Windows, the lower you kind of should balance it out in the game. In general, you should kind of think about the setting of mouse sensitivity in the game going hand in hand with sensitivity that is set outside of the game. And I can probably show you like how mine is set outside of the game here, if I manage to bring it up, which, there you go. It's a bit big, but you get the gist. This is how my mouse is set outside of the game. I run it at CPI 3500. I used to run it higher, but kind of got bored of having a higher CPI outside of a game. And so I kind of lowered it a bit, and now I'm running a 3500 CPI. This is pretty high as far as like mouse sort of CPI settings are concerned. Most people, the vast majority of players, will be playing at a setting somewhere between 1000 and 1500, I want to say. So my suggestion would be, don't start this high, because this is a very uncommon value. Start in the 1000 to 1500 CPI setting outside of game, unless you feel otherwise. Again, this is a big personal preference. There's no right or wrong with regards to mouse sensitivity. It's just something as you prefer. And then once you've done that, adjust your mouse sensitivity in game to match that level in a way that allows you to settle your aim reliably while still maintaining a relatively fast tracking speed in space. And we'll get into a minute as to what I mean with that, with a simple exercise. I think that's it as far as the mouse configuration is concerned. Oh yeah, those are the things that matter as far as the mouse configuration is concerned. Now, keyboard. And I'll bring up my control overlay to show you like how I've configured my keyboard. And I think this is easier than trying to kind of like go through the menu and do it on the menu, because it's kind of wonky. So you'll see I have a heatsink, which is, and maybe I can actually shift this to my keyboard so you can see also like how my fingers work with the actual configuration of this thing, because like that's a tricky part, and I might actually want to kind of like shift the camera in a way that you can actually see it. Yeah, over here. On the screen. The good thing about these tracking cameras is that they track you. The bad thing about these tracking cameras, if you actually want to kind of like point them in a given direction, you have to disable the tracking. Otherwise, obviously that results in not working. Let's see if we can get it now to where we want it. All right, that kind of is the thing. So now you should be able to see kind of like my hands and also the overlay to kind of like see how they work. So as you can see, I use my pinky finger and the tilde, how do you pronounce, I don't know how to pronounce that screen, like screen. That's how I kind of use my pinky finger for heat sinks. Hardpoints is kind of a utility thing that is right below it. Kind of, you don't use hardpoints that often, but you will use heat sinks all the time. So getting into like a rhythm where you have easy access to it from a muscle memory perspective is highly desirable. And the tilde key is good because there's like nothing around this key, right? So you kind of can immediately feel like if you got into it without having to look down, and like it's very easy for your hand to kind of reach out to the sink and know that you are on the sink button. The pinky finger, even with a kind of more limited sensitivity that you would normally have in your pinky finger compared to say your index and some of the other fingers. It's also something that allows you to retain your core fingers on the main controls, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And you'll notice that I have somewhat sort of different, somewhat kind of spread out controls as regards to thrust. So I have forward thrust on W, backward thrust on S, and I think this is pretty standard. In fact, I actually have these set as accelerate forward and accelerate backwards, which in flight assist off automatically convert to be thrust forward and thrust back, which is actually very convenient over mapping. And then one of the biggest choice and one of the biggest kind of like personal preferences is if you want to have lateral thrust on A and W and roll on Q and E up here, or if you want to switch these. So if you want to have roll on A and W and the lateral thrust on Q and E. Personally, I use lateral thrust more than I use roll. So I prefer to have the lateral thrust on the more easily accessible buttons. Otherwise, you kind of get into like a kind of claw, kind of weird spider grip if you're doing it like this. And this feels more unnatural to me. Instead, sort of using lateral thrust like this feels more natural. Also, like in many cases, you're kind of like going forward and right, or backward and right and down, something like this. But the important thing for me personally is that one of the things you want to be able to do in Elite is you want to be able to thrust on 3 dimensions at any given point in time. The reason you want to be able to thrust in 3 dimensions, see how I'm doing it like this, is that this is the maximum acceleration you can get in the game. If you're thrusting on 3 axes, you are getting the maximum possible acceleration on your ship. So in flight assist off, and if you're trying to really turn on the tight radius, this is how you do it. If you hit boost, you go and a trichord acceleration. This gives you the maximum rate of turn that a ship is able to do. Whether you want to, in this case, it would be forward, right, and down, or forward, right, and up. Like, same thing. I can hit all 3 very easily without having to move my hand entirely. All my fingers are, look at how it's like moving on the keyboard, like back to right. I am kind of like I'm barely ever moving my hand. All the keys are right around each other, and I can just use my fingers in a very easy, smooth, natural way that I've learned to do from a muscle memory perspective very reliably. The pinky is the one that moves the most. Like, the pinky is the one that actually moves the most. So this is where like you find yourself going up to heatsink every 10 seconds or so, like whenever your heatsink expires. That's something you kind of get used to. Or boost in case you want to boost or need to boost, but this is probably more relevant for boost orbiting ships. The scoop is right above boost for a reason, because in ships that require you to drop your scoop after you select your boost because you want to cap your speed, you boost and then you immediately have right above it the scoop button that allows you to cap your speed and change your vector in ways that are not possible without you kind of deploying, or in some cases, holding your scoop. And even then, you can hold your scoop or hit the boost while you still have like the fingers on the 3 trichord acceleration angles that matter, or change and thrust up. These are the most important keys. Like the thrust controls and the sort of boost and sinks are the most important keys. Like the need to roll is also very important. And roll typically, though, doesn't happen at the same time where you're kind of like thrusting right. You generally don't roll and thrust right at the same time. This generally doesn't happen, which is why having roll above the lateral thrust is a good toggle, because if you're rolling left, generally speaking, you're not thrusting left. You might still be going back and down. This can happen, or you might be going forward and down. This may happen, but it's very uncommon that you have roll left and thrust left. So this generally doesn't happen. All the things below, overall, all the sort of buttons below are kind of utilities. Like flight assist off, you just toggle it once you begin a fight, or in very special circumstances during the fight. This is more an advanced thing. It's good to have this handy, but it's not really critical. Landing gear, again, it's a utility. You generally use this when you're docking, because if you're kind of like using the boost scoop or boost gear, you generally will want to use the scoop. There's very specific circumstances where you may want to use the gear, but those are beyond the purpose of this video and kind of like don't matter that much. Mode switches from analysis to combat mode, and the FSSS is for the system scanner, which again, don't matter that much. Then there's a couple of keyboards. There's a couple of keys that only matter for specific build and specific circumstances. SS plus and SS minus are next subsystem and previous subsystem. If you're fighting an interceptor and you have a Xeno scanner installed and you've gotten a full scan, the next subsystem or previous subsystem will allow you to sub-target the hearts of the interceptor. This only really matters, but it matters a lot when you're using gimbaled weapons, which for AX means gimbaled, enhanced, and Xeno multi-cannons, or their pre-engineered counterpart, the so-called ADSIs. You will use this only when you're targeting hearts, when hearts are exerted, but you need to use these because otherwise your guns will not track hearts, and your guns need to track hearts to take down hearts. So these keys are necessary, but they're necessary only for very specific things. And then targeting ahead is obviously, well, targeting ahead. I also have target ahead on my middle mouse button here. So that's something that is a bit duplicated, and possibly I may change it up. And ECM is another special case thing. This mattered when we had rescues and we're dealing with sides more than anything else. Outside of dealing with sides, you don't really use ECM. So this is probably one of the least used keys on the keyboard for me. And then there's another key which is actually quite important, which is the Shutdown Field Neutralizer, which you need to hold. And again, this is something that you kind of like need to develop the muscle memory to go down here and hold it. But you do want to have a Shutdown Field Neutralizer key mapped, because relying on fire groups to use your Shutdown Field Neutralizer means that 80% of the time you're going to miss it because you won't get it in time. You're going to be confused. It is something that you need a hotkey to actually use in time, and you need to hold it. So like you'll be, again, something that you want to have direct access to. And then I have my Pip set almost everybody with a kind of like keys. Down is reset, left is system, top is eng, and right is swept. But the reality is, like many people, I actually have macro keys that set Pips in a particular configuration on my keyboard down here. Like these are Pip macro buttons, and these Pip macro buttons set my Pips to a particular configuration that is set for a particular ship and a particular fight that I want to do. This is a matter of like convenience. It matters more, it matters less, depending on what you're doing. It's probably not essential. Like there's no real fight, again, with extraordinary circumstances that requires you to have Pip macros to do it. Actually, I don't think of any that actually requires you to have Pip macros to do it, but it's a handy thing, kind of like for you to have from a quality of life standpoint. So, you know, let's all give it a go, and let's see also how you test whether like things are going. So you can see I'm like using my control key. I can get up, boost, and I'm kind of doing a little spin out here. And now we are out in open space. In order to test whether your controls are set, there's an exercise you can do when flight assist off to see if you're able to settle your aim. And now I'm gonna kind of disable my overlay, since I think you've seen enough of my overlay. And the exercise entails getting a reasonable amount of speed, so you're operating in speed like you'd be operating in an orbit, then toggle flight assist off. So we now have flight assist off, and then give the ship a good spin, so that you're kind of like in a hard spin, like if you were in a hard turn, and then pick a star in the background. I'm going to, let's say for the sake of argument, because it's easier to identify, I'm going to decide to kind of settle on the center of the sun. And once you kind of get to this sort of like point, like you kind of orbit around here and see how quickly you can settle your aim. And if you can settle your aim reasonably fast, then that's a good thing. Like give it another hard spin. Here's the sun. There we go. I kind of settle my aim like with 3 movements of my mouse generally. That's pretty good, and it's kind of settled relatively precisely, while I'm kind of like still moving, like also like in terms of like give it a boost. This is a spin. I got a higher rate on a higher velocity, and let's see, I can still kind of settle with, like in this case, 2, maybe 2.5 movements. That's what you're going for in terms of being able to control your ship and flight assist off. In order to be able to do this, you need relative mouse enabled, you need the relative rate cranked up, and you need to have your sensitivity at roughly the right level. Let me show you what happens if that isn't the case. Like if you disable, let's disable like relative mouse and crank mouse sensitivity up, just for the sake of showing you like what happens in that case. Okay. See how my aim, I think like my aim is kind of like bouncing back and forth. I am not able to set, I am literally unable to set my aim on the sun. I can't. I just cannot do it. It's impossible. Like no matter how hard I try, I'm still trying, still kind of fighting the ship, trying to settle my aim, on the star, and I can't. So this just doesn't work, as I've demonstrated. So let's go back to our settings and take one step, which is enable relative mouse. Now we have a relative rate up, but let's still keep our sensitivity still kind of pretty high, which something I would mention being too high. Now let's try the same. Let's give a ship a nice spin. See if we get this on. All right, like better, right? Now I'm getting closer. Like with a very long amount of time, I'm kind of managed to sort of settle my aim, but it's kind of very unstable, as you can see. I'm like still gonna like in the general vicinity. I'm kind of like sort of there, but I'm like kind of bouncing away from it, like quite a bit. And this is not a very stable setup. It's a lot better than before. All right, again, let's give it a boost and like flip it again. All right, somewhat better, but still really not very good. My aim is bouncing around like crazy. All right, now let's do it the proper way, which is to lower the sensitivity to a point where that balance is broadly achieved. So let's try closer to where it was at the beginning of my video. All right, let's go up. Here's the sun. Oh, my controls are off here. And know how I get there slower, but then I kind of like stabilize on it. But I got there really slow to a point where I'm like, you know, the ship kind of barely turned. So this is probably the thing that I went to my sensitivity being kind of too low. Like I have to make a big movement of my mouse to kind of like stop the ship from going all the way up. I can set my aim just fine. So we got the sensitivity to a point where it's not too high anymore. But I also have to make two big movements of my hand to actually be able to either give a ship a spin or stop the ship from spinning. So let's get it somewhere in between where we kind of like had it, I think, closer to where I was from the beginning. Like give it another spin, another hard spin. And here's the star. And there you go. And that's what you want. That's what we know. It's still not perfectly stable, but it's stable enough to kind of be able to kind of shoot the center of a heart, which is like, you know, the inner center of a star, while actively moving, like being able to kind of move your aim and rotate your ship like reasonably fast overall. There we go. And this aim has settled. So this kind of sounds, and I'll kind of go back to having my camera like looking at me. I have to see enough of my controls, I think. There we go. I actually fixed the camera for proper tracking. As I enable auto tracking. Mark on position. Let's see if this works. All right. Camera has been restored. So this is the most important thing to get you to be able to control your ship properly in Elite Dangerous. And it's the single-handed thing that transformed pilot just flailing and flight assist off basically say, oh, I'm never going to fly in flight assist off. It's too hard. It doesn't work. I can't control the ship. It goes all over the place. To people who actually say, oh, okay, I get it. Now I understand how it works and it's amazing and I can actually finally fly the ship in FA off. This is the reason and this is how you do it. So that's my experience with controls. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, it's a very personal thing. There's no right or wrong. There's things that work better for some and work better for others. I've shared what works for me and how I do it because I got a lot of people asking about it and because some of the things I learned might be helpful for others, but I'd love to know how you feel about controls in Elite Dangerous and whether you follow these controls or whether you do something different or whether there's something I said which you disagree with or otherwise you feel you can add. So that's it for today. Go to Mechan, come on to Mechan, over and out.